The following debate will outline multiple perspectives of legalized prostitution. The ethical dilemma is present within the idea as it states that both decriminalization and legalization of commercial sex can disempower sellers and put vulnerable people at risk of being harmed or exploited. Using ethical theories surrounding virtue ethics, exploitation, and utilitarianism, the debated topic will outline the complex nature of ethics, particularly where there is uncertainty of the general outcome of prostitution. On the negative team, I will be accompanied by Nadia to argue the outcome of decriminalization over legalization, whilst the affirmative argument for full legalization will be presented by Jordan, who will begin the first part with an affirmative argument.
Thank you. Now, the movement towards legalized prostitution is a widely analysed and controversial topic. As it stands today in Australia, every state has different laws regarding sex work and prostitution, but no state has fully legalised it. The states with the least decriminalised regulations include New South Wales, Victoria, and ACT, which allow agencies, brothels, and private escorts to operate. Queensland and the Northern Territory allow brothels and private escorts, whilst WA and South Australia and Tasmania only allow private escorts. Over the years, numerous positive arguments for the legalization of prostitution have been investigated, such as economic growth, circulation, reduction in human trafficking, body autonomy, the movement towards sex positivity, and that legalization provides protection for both clients and workers. However, today I want to step away from the traditional arguments and instead talk about the ethical arguments of legalization. With reference to utilitarianism, the ethical theory that the morally right decision is the decision that benefits the most people, I want to break down the act of prostitution to its simplest form, an exchange of currency for a service provided. As it stands in Australia, there are 296 operating brothels worth over 141 million to the Australian economy, with a predicted growth of 4.6% annually. And this doesn't even include the thousands of private providers or hundreds of legal agencies. Furthermore, within Australia, the lowest estimation of clients who have paid for sexual services is 15.6%, ranking Australia to have the 11th highest usage of sexual work internationally. As sex work is a consensual transaction, and the data has proven that a large percentage of people are willing to partake in that transaction, it can be argued with a utilitarian viewpoint that, as no one is harmed, the legalization of prostitution can only be beneficial to both workers, clients, and the economy. Some data even suggests that the legalization of prostitution will lead to a reduction in human trafficking, an undeniably positive outcome. This overall demonstrates that more people stand to benefit from this legalization, further proving with the utilitarian view that the best decision for the Australian government would be to fully legalize prostitution. Nathan from the negative team will now be presenting his opening arguments.
Now, in the context of utilitarianism, a set of actions are justified if they're useful or for the benefit of majority. Whilst you can argue that the benefits for prostitutes is monetary compensation, the increased risk of potentially negative health and social consequences, along with potentially assault, homicide, or sexually transmitted infections, completely disregards that perspective and lowers the happiness levels. Hence, whilst utilitarianism can justify that both the suppliers of sex and the recipients can benefit from prostitution in some form, the concept of prostitution is still considered immoral given its potential dangers. It should also be noted that Mill's idea of utilitarianism pleasure stems from intellectual capabilities more so than physical pleasures. As such, with the belief that people should focus on pursuits on enhancing their mind and progressive culture more so than succumbing to lower pleasures such as sexual desires. It should also be noted that 62.4% of men involved in prostitution are generally married, and many of the prostitutes are as well. The essence of Jeremy Bentham and Mill's utilitarianism places importance of adhering to moral rules. The act of cheating and thus lying to protect relationships is immoral as it harms others even if the prostitutes and recipients benefit. Georgia will now present the second part of the affirmative argument.
Before addressing the affirmative further, I'd just like to respond to your arguments, Nathan. Firstly, you argued that the legalization of sex work does not benefit the majority due to negative health and social consequences. However, legalization of prostitution would allow for non-discriminatory health coverage for sex workers and would enforce the use of protective sex and regular STI checkups. For example, in decriminalized states, all providers must screen for STIs at a minimum of every 3 months, and they must provide their services with the use of protection, including for oral services. A study analyzing data from 27 European countries found that in countries where sex work is legalized, there's a much lower rate of STIs, especially HIV, than in countries where it is fully criminalized. suggesting that the ability for open disclosure that legalization would allow leads to harm prevention. Furthermore, legalization allows for regulation and protection of sex workers, which means workers can report violations and abuse more easily with less stigma surrounding the allegations. Regarding the morality of infidelity in clients, I'd just like to address that research suggests that around 20% of men cheat on their spouses or partners, and as do 13% of women. However, there's no data to suggest that the legalization of prostitution increases these percentages. While sex work provides an avenue for infidelity, it does not cause infidelity. And to be put in more harsh terms, simply people cheat. So why should the sex workers and the single clients suffer the consequences of these actions when their actions themselves might not be morally wrong? Additionally, it's controversial to state that sex workers in relationships are cheating when sex work is just a form of employment. Sex workers have to follow regulations, pay taxes, and have licenses. Furthermore, when I interviewed a Brisbane brothel service provider about infidelity in the sex work industry, she said this: of the 34 service providers working in my brothel, 15 are in committed relationships, only one of which has not disclosed her work with her spouse, and 6 have partners who also work within the industry. Although this is a small sample size, I think it brings up the larger point of contention, which is that relationships are diverse and complicated, and it's not on government or society to address which actions are unethical in relationships, but instead on the parties involved. And whilst I agree that cheating is immoral in a relationship, no data suggests that the legalization of prostitution either enhances or reduces the rates of infidelity in relationships, thus meaning that you can't conclude with certainty that legalization is morally damaging to society. Additionally, sex workers also provide their services to single individuals, widowers, and other members of society that for numerous reasons may stand to benefit from a sexual relationship or service that does not intrude upon their personal lives. Simply put, the negative argument presented does not disregard the utilitarian good that sex work provides to both clients, workers, and economic growth. I'll now pass back to Nathan to present further opposing arguments.
The conflicting argument to your claims is the capitalistic advantages of legalizing prostitution in conjunction with the exploitation of women's bodies. If prostitution was to be legalized, the government would have trouble controlling the operations and may eventually neglect the unethical components for both tax and economic benefit. If legalized, there is no evidence to suggest that the violence or abuse around prostitutes will be regulated off the black market, and many governments will continue to profit from this exploitation. The government would essentially be benefiting and would not be able to morally monitor many aspects of this kind of operation. For example, there is a tendency for some women or men to be forced to have sex when they might not actually want to, like slavery. Also, in many cases, these people do not freely decide to become prostitutes or are driven by some other life aspects, such as monetary burden. This shows the complexities of measuring who would actually benefit from prostitution and whether the greatest number of people will receive the greatest good. The concept of ethical relativism should not be ignored either. The legalization of prostitution may be acceptable in some countries, but in major countries such as China, India, North Korea, America, Thailand, and Australia, it goes against multiple religious and cultural beliefs. Thus, the wider community would not find happiness in legalizing this change. They would be ultimately grounded in their original beliefs and perspectives that would harm individuals and society in both tangible and non-tangible ways. Georgia will now present the third part of the affirmative argument.
In response to your argument, Nathan, I'd like to provide some data. In response to the introduction of decriminalization of sex work in Australia, there was no observable expansion of the size of the sex industry. Furthermore, when looking at the New Zealand model of legalized prostitution, there's been no increase in street prostitution. This indicates that the legalization of prostitution does not lead to an expansion in the industry, meaning that simply put, prostitution will likely exist whether it's legal or not. However, by not legalizing prostitution, the government would be further harming providers, as their actions could result in fines or even sentencing. Additionally, it's reasonable to assume that in the proposed model where prostitution isn't legalized, women who enter in the profession will likely be considerably low income, as they likely wouldn't have many other options. This would only further harm providers. Moreover, whilst the regulation of sex work would certainly be beneficial to the government, so is every new and emerging industry. Economic growth and circulation and employment offers benefits regardless of what that employment is. Therefore, I believe you singling out sex work is based on stigma alone. I believe it's deplorable of you to compare sex work to the apparent illegal sex trade human trafficking industry, and your comparison to slavery is disgustingly hyperbolic. Furthermore, there is data to suggest that the legalization of prostitution decreases human trafficking. For example, since the legalization of prostitution in New Zealand, there has been a dramatic decrease in human rights violations occurring within the country. And in relation to your ethical relativism argument, I think that when looking at prostitution in an Australian context, it's unreasonable to state the majority would not find happiness in this legal change based on assumptions of cultural perspective from countries outside of Australia. Furthermore, the legalization of prostitution does not force individuals of a particular cultural opinion or perspective on the topic to interact with the industry if they don't wish to. I believe that a better ethical theory to apply to the legalization of prostitution would be virtue ethics, the ethical viewpoint that good actions are defined by displays of virtuous character. Whilst once upon a time, the sex work industry was largely judged and looked down upon and could once be considered unvirtuous, as a society, we're now moving forwards towards a more sex positive viewpoint, with open discussions being held about the sex industry and sex workers. With this shift in society, virtuism in a more traditional context is being challenged. Who's to say that sex work isn't a virtuous career? Does it not take social skills, patience, physical ability, or intelligence to be a sex worker? Especially private escorts who manage their own advertising costs and budget. Are they not as virtuous as any other entrepreneur simply because the service they provide is sex? Prostitution is a controversial topic, but it's my belief that the negative assumption that the legalization of prostitution would cause harm or is unmoral is rooted more in stigma than statistics. I'll now pass over the negative once again for their closing statements.
Contrary to the previous argument, a virtue ethics approach would condemn the prostitution since paying for a sexual favor without any aspect of love involved would not be considered a virtuous. So key virtuous figures in society would not remove the prestigious intrinsic value of sex by paying for a random stranger to perform the sexual act for them. So the entire aspect of love would not be removed from this equation, making sex unethical. So according to Kant theory, prostitution is immorally and ethically wrong and should not be allowed. So society needs to look at not only the act of the prostitutions, but also the prostitute itself. So this is where one can just justify the prostitute by looking at the circumstances or the situation in which caused the persons to become a prostitute itself. So this judgment then will then cause pain and suffering in the life of those that had to choose a prostitution as a means of supporting their children. So Barkerman defined virtue as what is in the heart of a person, not the reason behind the act. Therefore, a woman who has to choose to become a prostitute is because they had no other choice as the means of supporting their children's need, which can be considered very courageous and brave, but that doesn't occur if the criminalizations doesn't occur. Because the criminalizations, when there's no law, this will then help the individuals with their mental and the physical pressure of being a prostitute, because then she already has decided herself and knows that she's morally wrong. So therefore, if our society would decriminalize prostitution, then it would help women deal with the mental distress and guilt that goes with the act of prostitution. And a woman who has forsaken her personal ethic may result in drugs and alcohol abuse, mental depressions, and even suicide. In addition, the prostitute then may be able to further her educations, and one may be able to put the prostitutions away from her entire life completely. In conclusion, there's no doubt that the legalizations of prostitution is a delicate matter because of its complex moral questioning. However, most would argue that it serves a greater purpose in the context of utilitarianism, and the legalizations will serve the wider interests of those involved. Thank you.